So I want you to picture a scene from early 1945.
Okay.
The backdrop is this collapsing, just desperate Nazi Germany. The Soviet Red Army is advancing relentlessly from the east, and you can literally hear artillery echoing just 100 miles away.
It's absolute apocalyptic chaos.
Exactly. And right in the middle of this, there's a man fleeing for his life. His left arm is completely shattered. It's wrapped in this cumbersome, hastily applied plaster cast from a recent car wreck.
Right.
But he's not just some refugee trying to slip past the front lines. He is actively orchestrating the covert relocation of 500 top-tier rocket scientists.
Which is just an immense logistical nightmare.
Oh, it's massive. He is forging military transport orders on the fly. He's coordinating the burial of 13 tons of highly classified technical blueprints in an abandoned iron mine.
Getting in the hearts of mountains, yeah.
Right, and as the net closes, he sends his younger brother, who happens to speak a little broken English, pedaling out on a bicycle to the advancing American lines to negotiate a surrender.
I mean, it really has all the hallmarks of a Hollywood spy thriller climax.
It totally does.
You've got the forged documents, the secret blueprints in a mine, the desperate bicycle ride to the enemy. But what makes the sequence so incredibly compelling is that it isn't fiction.
No, it's real.
It is the unvarnished historical reality of a moment that completely altered the technological trajectory of the 20th century. Like, if that surrender doesn't happen exactly the way it did, the map of the Cold War looks fundamentally different.
Yeah, and the man with the shattered arm isn't Jason Bourne. It's Wernher von Braun.
Right.
So today we are doing a deep dive into an absolute mountain of biographical source material on von Braun. Because to understand how humanity finally touched the stars, you really have to look at the staggering, honestly terrifying moral compromises made by the man who built the stairs.
He is universally recognized as the father of space travel. I mean, he's the chief architect of the colossal Saturn V rocket that allowed Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to walk on the moon.
Which is an achievement that stands as one of the defining triumphs of human ingenuity.
Absolutely. But the other side of that exact same coin is deeply unsettling.
Yeah.
He was also a former SS officer. He was a man who developed weapons of absolute terror for Adolf Hitler's Third Reich.
Specifically, the V-2 ballistic missile.
Exactly. And he utilized a manufacturing process that relied upon unimaginable human suffering and concentration camp slave labor.
So if you're wondering why diving into this history matters today, it's because von Braun's life is the ultimate case study in the relentless, almost obsessive pursuit of a singular dream.
It forces us to ask a really profound, uncomfortable question.
How do you possibly reconcile the brilliant mind that reached the lunar surface with the hands that worked alongside the darkest depths of human cruelty?
It's a huge paradox, and to even begin unpacking it, we have to strip away the decades of myth-making.
Right, both the hero worship of the Apollo era and the simplistic villain caricatures.
Yeah, we have to look at the chronological evolution of the man. And that evolution starts long before there was a space race and long before there was a Second World War. It actually starts in Prussia in 1912.
Right in the heart of serious European aristocracy. We're talking family trees that trace back to medieval royalty.
Oh, yeah. The sources point out lineages connecting to Philip III of France, Valdemar I of Denmark, Edward III of England.
His father was a conservative politician too, right? A minister in the Weimar Republic.
He was. So von Braun is growing up surrounded by immense privilege, massive estates, and political influence.
But the spark that ignites his entire life has absolutely nothing to do with politics. It actually comes from his mother.
Right.
After his Lutheran confirmation, she gives him a telescope.
And that single gift shifts his gaze permanently upward. But, you know, there is a fascinating contradiction in his early life that completely defies what you might expect.
Oh, with his grades.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You naturally assume the father of rocket science was a child prodigy, like a mathematical genius from day one.
Right, you'd think he'd be doing calculus at age 6.
Exactly. But the documentation reveals he actually struggled significantly with mathematics and physics when he was sent away to boarding school at Ettersburg Castle.
He was failing math.
He was not a natural-born physicist at all.
Which is just wild to think about. The guy who eventually oversees the calculations for orbital mechanics to get a capsule to the moon was failing math as a teenager.
But then he stumbles across a book.
Yeah, and not just a sci-fi novel. It's a book called By Rocket into Planetary Space by the early rocket pioneer, Hermann Oberth.
And this isn't Jules Verne. Oberth is laying out the actual physics of escaping Earth's gravity.
Right, he's doing the math. And finding this book basically flips a switch in von Braun's brain.
Von Braun later credited Oberth as the guiding star of his life, because Oberth wasn't just dreaming about space. He was using a slide rule to prove it was mathematically possible.
He was calculating thrust-to-weight ratios and exhaust velocities.
Exactly. And for young von Braun, it was an absolute revelation. Space travel wasn't just fantasy anymore. It was an engineering problem waiting to be solved.
And to solve it, he suddenly had a tangible, desperate reason to master the physics and mathematics he had been completely neglecting.
Right, math was no longer abstract. It was literally the language of spaceflight.
And he doesn't just quietly study it in a library. He acts on it.
Yeah.
He's a teenager during this whole 1928 fad in Germany called the Rocket Rumble. Rocket Rumble.
Oh, man, the rocket rumble.
Yeah, you have guys like Fritz von Opel and Max Valier doing these wild, highly publicized demonstrations of rocket-powered cars.
Which were incredibly dangerous.
Oh, incredibly. So von Braun sees this, gets incredibly hyped, and decides to do it himself.
Of course he does.
He takes a homemade toy wagon, goes out and buys the most massive fireworks he can get his hands on, straps them to the wagon, and launches it down a crowded sidewalk.
With entirely predictable, chaotic results.
Yeah.
The solid fuel fireworks ignited, the wagon shot down the street, caused a massive disruption, and the young aristocrat ended up in local police custody.
Until his dad had to come down and retrieve him for disciplinary action.
Exactly.
It's the 1920s equivalent of a modern kid strapping illegal fireworks to a skateboard and letting it rip through a busy downtown intersection.
It's reckless.
It's rebellious, but it completely highlights his lifelong, stubborn determination. From that moment in police custody, the die was cast.
And his academic trajectory immediately reflects that singular obsessive focus. By 1930, he is at the Technische Hochschule in Berlin.
Right.
And he joins the Spaceflight Society, the VFR. And this is crucial. They aren't just talking about rockets. They are physically working on liquid-fueled rocket motor tests in a makeshift testing ground outside Berlin.
He graduates with a mechanical engineering diploma in 1932. He even manages to meet the famous high-altitude balloonist Auguste Piccard.
Yeah, and he boldly tells him, I plan on traveling to the moon at some time.
The audacity of a 20-year-old student walking up to a world-famous explorer and declaring he's going to the moon is incredible.
It really is.
So, by 1934, he earns his PhD in physics. But his thesis defense is where the story takes a sharp turn into the geopolitical reality of the era.
Right.
His public thesis was given a completely innocuous title, something like about combustion tests.
Right, super boring sounding.
But his actual thesis, the one that detailed the construction, design, and physics of his liquid propellant A-2 rocket, was immediately classified by the German army.
In fact, it stayed classified until 1960.
Which naturally brings up the question, why was the German army paying such close attention to a 20-something graduate student's amateur rocket experiments in the early 1930s?
The answer is entirely rooted in the fallout of World War I.
The Treaty of Versailles.
Exactly. The Treaty of Versailles had severely restricted Germany's military capabilities. It limited the size of their army, it outright banned heavy artillery, tanks, and the development of an air force.
But there was a loophole.
A massive oversight. As historian Norman Davies details in the sources, the drafters of the treaty completely omitted rocketry from the list of forbidden weapons.
Because in 1919, when the treaty was signed, rockets were basically viewed as battlefield flare guns or science fiction.
Right.
They weren't considered a serious military threat capable of delivering payloads.
Exactly. The architects of Versailles couldn't foresee the technological leap from a firework to a ballistic missile. So it created this massive legal loophole.
Wow.
The German military high command recognized that if they could develop long-range ballistic missiles, they could bypass the Versailles artillery restrictions entirely.
They could strike targets from afar without technically breaking the treaty.
Yes. So the army effectively co-opted von Braun and his amateur rocket society. The Weimar Republic's military provided the funding, the test stands at Kummersdorf, and the raw resources that von Braun desperately needed to transition from toy wagons to real machines.
It's a profound pivot point.
Yeah.
A kid who failed math becomes the father of rocket science because he found the right book. And he gets his funding because of a geopolitical treaty loophole.
But the transition from a starry-eyed kid dreaming of the moon to a man building weapons of terror doesn't happen in a vacuum.
No, because in 1933, the Nazi Party comes to power.
And that transition isn't an overnight ideological radicalization for von Braun. It's a steady, pragmatic absorption into the machinery of the state.
Right.
When Hitler's coalition takes over, the military buildup accelerates exponentially, and rocketry is elevated to a top-tier national agenda item.
The funding becomes practically limitless compared to what his little rocket society had.
Oh, yeah. By 1939, von Braun is appointed as the technical advisor at the Peenemünde Army Research Center,
which was this massive, highly secretive, state-of-the-art facility built on the Baltic Sea coast, dedicated entirely to aerospace and rocket development.
But von Braun wasn't just a civilian contractor taking their money from arm's length. He integrated into the political system.
Right. The sources show he officially joined the Nazi Party in November 1937. And then in 1940, he joined the SS.
The Allgemeine SS, yeah.
And he was eventually promoted to the rank of Major, or Sturmbannführer, by Heinrich Himmler himself.
Now, when confronted with this after the war, von Braun's defense of these memberships leaned heavily on the idea that he was a trapped opportunist.
He claimed he had to.
Right. He claimed that in 1939 he was officially demanded to join the party, and that refusing would have meant abandoning his life's work and his team.
And what about the SS?
Regarding the SS, he stated that Heinrich Himmler sent a colonel to his office urging him to join. Von Braun claimed he went to his military superior, General Walter Dornberger, who told him that if he wanted to continue their rocketry work in peace, he had no alternative but to accept.
I mean, I understand the instinct for self-preservation in a totalitarian regime.
Yeah.
But you can't just wave away an SS uniform by saying, oh, I was an opportunist trying to keep my rocket funding.
Right.
He later claimed he only wore the uniform once for a formal picture with Himmler. But the sources cite a former SS officer stationed at Peenemünde who told the BBC that von Braun regularly wore the uniform to official meetings.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a piece of paper in a file cabinet. It was a physical manifestation of his alignment with the regime.
It is the defining moral paradox of his life. Right. And we have to look at the historical reality of his situation impartially.
Right.
The FBI, decades later, conducted extensive background checks for his security clearances.
What did they find?
Their conclusion was that his involvement in the Nazi Party appeared purely designed for the advancement of his academic and professional career, or out of fear of imprisonment or execution.
Okay.
Michael Neufeld, a prominent aerospace historian whose work is featured in our sources, notes that von Braun was raised as a conservative, right-wing nationalist, which was typical of his aristocratic Prussian background. But he seemed to take little initial interest in Nazi racial ideology. However, as the regime poured unprecedented resources into his rockets, he became increasingly accommodating to their demands.
And what he was building with those resources was scientifically unprecedented, but militarily devastating.
Absolutely.
They were developing the A4 rocket, which the propaganda ministry later renamed the V2 for Geltungswaffe 2, meaning Vengeance Weapon 2.
But interestingly, Hitler wasn't actually sold on the concept at first.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it took a massive PR push from von Braun in 1943 to secure the final unyielding support of the Führer.
Wow. How did he do that?
Von Braun traveled to Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, and showed him a color film of a successful A4 launch.
Okay.
And he didn't just show the film, he provided this passionate, highly technical narration of the rocket's capabilities. Hitler was so thrilled by the sheer destructive potential and the technological wizardry shown in that footage that he personally conferred the title of Professor upon von Braun.
That is wild.
And we really must understand how mechanically terrifying the V2 was. It wasn't an airplane you could shoot down or hear coming.
Right, you couldn't defend against it.
No. It utilized gyroscopic guidance, mixing liquid oxygen and alcohol to achieve massive thrust. It traveled at supersonic speeds, meaning it struck its target before the sound of its approach could even be heard.
That is a terrifying psychological weapon. No air raid sirens, no warning, just sudden devastation.
Exactly.
And scientifically, it broke boundaries we hadn't even defined yet. On June 20, 1944, a V2 launched vertically from Peenemünde became the very first artificial object to cross the Kármán line.
Which is the recognized boundary between Earth's atmosphere and outer space.
It was a monumental achievement in physics.
Yeah.
He successfully pushed human engineering into space for the first time in history.
Yet the machine that crossed that threshold was expressly designed to indiscriminately bomb civilian population centers in London and Antwerp.
It's just so dark.
It is.
There is also a fascinating controversy embedded in the development of the V2, involving the American rocket pioneer Robert Goddard.
Yes, the Goddard depression.
Goddard had been doing his own liquid fuel tests in the U.S., and he later claimed von Braun essentially stole his intellectual property to build the V2.
The Goddard connection is a really complex web of public research and classified espionage. Before the war, German scientists were actively reading Goddard's published papers.
Right.
And they did contact him with technical questions, which is pretty common in scientific communities.
Sure, open academic exchange.
But during the war, parts of a crashed V-2 were recovered in Sweden and secretly shipped to the U.S.
Wow.
Goddard examined the wreckage and recognized specific components, like the methods for injecting fuel into the combustion chamber and the use of steering vanes in the exhaust plume that he had pioneered. He inferred his brainchild had been weaponized.
How did von Braun respond to that?
Von Braun vehemently denied ever seeing a specific Goddard patent or stealing blueprints, though he freely admitted that Goddard's early trailblazing was crucial and conceptually incorporated into their designs.
But, debates over patent theft pale in comparison to the human cost of the V-2's production.
They really do.
The atrocities committed to build these rockets represent the absolute darkest chapter of this deep dive. In 1943, the British Royal Air Force realized what was happening at Peenemünde and launched Operation Hydra, heavily bombing the facility.
Right. Because the surface facilities were now vulnerable to Allied air raids, the Nazi High Command, specifically an incredibly brutal SS general named Hans Kammler, decided to move the entire V-2 manufacturing operation underground.
To hide it.
Exactly. They utilized an existing gypsum mine beneath the Kohnstein Mountain in central Germany, creating the Mittelwerk plant.
And Kammler's solution for the massive labor shortage required to build this subterranean factory and assemble the rockets.
He utilized concentration camp prisoners.
The numbers are sickening. The V-2 is the only weapon system in human history where more people died manufacturing it than were killed by it as a deployed weapon.
It's a horrific statistic.
The rockets killed thousands in London and Antwerp, but an estimated 20,000 prisoners died at the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp complex.
They died from typhus, starvation, beatings, hangings, and the suffocating ammonia dust in those freezing underground tunnels.
And von Braun was physically there. He admitted to visiting the Mittelwerk plant on multiple occasions.
He later described the conditions as repulsive.
But his defense remained steadfast throughout his life. He claimed he was helpless to change anything, that the SS ran the facility with an iron fist, and that he never personally witnessed any deaths or beatings during his visits.
But if you look at the survivor testimonies, that defense fractures.
It totally falls apart.
The sources detail accounts from French resistance prisoners who were enslaved there. Guy Moran testified that von Braun personally ordered a prisoner to be flogged after a sabotage attempt on an engine part.
And Robert Caspon stated, von Braun stood by as prisoners were hanged by chains from the tunnel cranes.
Now, some historians carefully analyzing these accounts suggest there might be cases of mistaken identity, given the sheer number of German engineers and the chaotic, traumatizing environment of the camps.
It is entirely possible there were misidentifications.
Right.
However, even if we assume von Braun never personally ordered a flogging, the environment he operated within was absolutely saturated with death.
Adam Kabbalah, another survivor, stated von Braun walked so close to piles of tortured corpses near the ambulance shed that he almost touched them and never once raised a word of protest.
I mean, you can't claim opportunism when you are literally walking past the bodies of the people forced to build the combustion chambers you designed. The cognitive dissonance required to focus on the stars while standing in a mass grave is just unfathomable.
It is the ultimate manifestation of psychological compartmentalization.
Yeah.
He isolated his engineering goals from the human toll required to achieve them. When von Braun team member Konrad Dannenberg, who had been a Nazi Party member since 1932, was asked years later if von Braun could have protested the conditions to save lives,
What did he say?
Dannenberg bluntly stated that if von Braun had spoken out, he would have been shot on the spot.
Wow.
General Kammler would not have hesitated. We are looking at the grim historical reality of survival, ambition, and moral blindness within an absolute totalitarian regime. Von Braun made a devil's bargain. He received the funding and facilities to build his spaceships, but the devil demanded they be built with the blood of innocents.
And the terrifying irony of totalitarianism is that even playing along, even closing your eyes to the bodies, wasn't enough to keep him safe from the regime's paranoia.
No, nobody was safe.
In March 1944, the Gestapo actually arrests von Braun. The golden boy of the V-2 program gets thrown into a cell.
And the reason why is almost absurd.
An SS spy, a female dentist, overheard him at a party. She claimed he was expressing regret that they were building weapons instead of spaceships and complaining that the war wasn't going well for Germany.
To the Gestapo and the SS, expressing doubt about a German victory was treasonous defeatism.
Right.
But there was also a massive political power struggle happening behind the scenes. Heinrich Himmler was actively trying to wrestle complete control of the V2 program away from the German army and bring it entirely under the umbrella of the SS via General Kemmler.
Ah, so it was a power grab.
Exactly. Arresting von Braun, the civilian face of the army's project, was a calculated power play by Himmler to show the army they couldn't protect their own people. Von Braun was locked in a Gestapo cell in Stettin for 2 weeks, entirely unsure if he was going to be executed.
He only gets out because Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, intervenes.
Right.
Speer basically goes to Hitler and says, look, we cannot build this vengeance weapon without this specific guy's brain.
And Hitler reluctantly agrees to release him, realizing von Braun is completely indispensable to the war effort.
So he survived the Gestapo solely because his intellectual capital was too valuable for the regime to destroy.
Yes.
But fast forward to early 1945, and the reality that von Braun had whispered about at that party had come to pass. The Third Reich was entirely collapsing.
The Soviet Red Army was closing in on Peenemünde from the east.
Von Braun was forced to make the ultimate calculation. The war is definitively lost. The rockets belong to whoever captures them, so who gets the engineers?
And the sheer logistics of what happens next are staggering.
It's crazy.
It's early 1945. The Soviets are just 100 miles away. Von Braun gathers his top engineering staff, the core brain trust of the V2 program, and they take a secret vote.
And what do they decide?
They unanimously decide they would rather surrender to the Americans.
Okay.
But they are trapped between two conflicting suicidal orders. The SS general, Kemmler, orders them to move to central Germany to continue working underground. Meanwhile, the local army command orders the scientists to literally pick up rifles and fight the advancing Soviet tanks as infantry.
It's infantry. That's insane. So von Braun uses the chaos and the conflicting orders to his advantage. He fabricates military transport documents, plastering official-looking acronyms on trucks and trains, and manages to transport 500 of his scientific affiliates away from the Eastern Front toward the Mittelwerk area in central Germany.
He recognizes that their true value to the Allies won't be in the physical rockets, but in their intellectual property and research data.
So he orders his team to pack up 14 tons of classified V2 blueprints, schematics, and test results, and hide them deep inside an abandoned iron mine in the Hardy Mountains,
ensuring they wouldn't be destroyed by the SS or captured by the Soviets before the Americans arrived.
And while all this high-stakes maneuvering is happening, his driver falls asleep at the wheel.
Yeah, they get into a massive car crash.
This is where he suffers that complicated fracture of his left arm and shoulder that we talked about at the beginning.
But he refuses to stop moving.
He has a local doctor put it in a massive plaster cast, and he keeps directing the evacuation. Eventually, the injury is so neglected and infected, they have to hospitalize him, physically re-break the bones, and reset them.
The pain must have been blinding.
The desperation was palpable. As the Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany from both sides, the SS ordered the entire engineering team to be moved to Oberammergau in the Bavarian Alps.
And the SS guards accompanying them had explicit chilling orders.
What were they?
If capture by the enemy becomes imminent, execute the entire scientific team.
Why?
The Reich's top scientists were not to fall into Allied hands alive.
But von Braun uses his aristocratic charm and fast-talking to manipulate the SS major in charge, a guy named Kummer.
He convinces Kummer that keeping 450 top scientists clumped together in one small alpine village makes them a prime target for American bomber squadrons.
Right.
He argues they should disperse into the surrounding villages to avoid being wiped out from the air.
And Kummer buys the logic and lets them scatter.
It was a brilliant tactical deception. By dispersing the scientists into small groups across the mountains, von Braun effectively neutralized the SS guards' ability to execute them all at once.
Right.
Finally, on May 6, 1945, knowing American troops from the 44th Infantry Division were pushing into the valleys, von Braun sends his brother Magnus out.
Because Magnus spoke some English.
Right, so he rode a bicycle down the mountain, approached an American private, and delivered the famous line. "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V2. We want to surrender."
And the Americans knew exactly the prize they had just been handed. Von Braun was at the absolute top of the blacklist, the Allied target list of high-value German scientists.
The U.S. immediately kicks off Operation Paperclip,
which eventually sweeps up von Braun, his hidden blueprints, his core team, and eventually over 1,000 other German scientists, bringing them to the United States.
We really have to view Operation Paperclip through the geopolitical lens of 1945.
How so?
Well, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was already brewing before the hot war against Germany even ended. The Americans didn't just want von Braun's mind so they could build their own ballistic missiles. It was equally imperative to ensure the Soviet Union did not get his mind.
It was a zero-sum game for post-war technological supremacy.
Exactly. If the Soviets captured the team that built the V-2, the balance of power would immediately shift.
So the U.S. military ships von Braun and his core team of 118 engineers across the Atlantic and dumps them at Fort Bliss, Texas.
And the culture shock they experience is monumental.
Von Braun later complained that at Peenemünde he had thousands of engineers and laborers answering to him. He was coddled. He had limitless state budgets.
And now?
He's in the dusty, suffocating heat of the Texas desert. They are strictly confined to the base with military escorts living in dilapidated wooden barracks, and the military won't even give them enough budget to lay linoleum over their cracked floors.
The transition in status was incredibly jarring. Within their own ranks, the German team still deferentially called him Herr Professor.
Right.
But his new American boss was a 26-year-old Army major named Jim Hamill.
Wow, a 26-year-old.
Yeah, Hamill only had an undergraduate engineering degree, but he was in charge. He called von Braun Wernher. He counted every single penny of their meager budget, and he routinely dismissed von Braun's grandiose proposals for new space-oriented rocket ideas.
From Hamill's perspective, he was just managing a captive workforce of former enemy combatants whose only job was to help the Army reverse engineer captured V-2 parts. It's like a superstar Fortune 500 CEO suddenly being forced to work as a junior intern for a mid-level manager half his age.
His ego was profoundly bruised.
The Germans jokingly called themselves Pop's prisoners of peace.
Right.
They were essentially teaching American military personnel the basic plumbing of rocketry. But von Braun is sitting there in the desert, staring at the sky, desperate to build ships for the moon.
But Hamill wasn't going to give him a dime for space travel.
So von Braun realized he had to bypass the Pentagon entirely and go straight to the American taxpayer.
Right. Stuck with no budget and an apathetic military oversight, von Braun recognizes a fundamental truth about American democratic society.
Preach us.
The military and the government will not fund a massive, unprecedented project unless there is overwhelming public support demanding it. If he couldn't convince Major Hamill, he needed to convince the American public that space was the next logical frontier.
And his pivot to public relations is masterclass. Starting around 1950, von Braun launches one of the most effective, widespread PR campaigns in the history of science.
He publishes a heavily detailed series of articles in Collier's weekly magazine, which had a massive readership.
Titled Man Will Conquer Space Soon.
Yes. And these aren't just vague, wishful sci-fi dreams. They're illustrated by Chesley Bonestell with gorgeous photorealistic art and backed by von Braun's hardcore slide rule engineering.
His proposals in Collier's were staggering in their detail and scope. He didn't just say we should go to space. He designed a 250-foot diameter rotating wheel space station orbiting 1,000 miles up.
And he explained the physics of it to the public.
Right.
By rotating the wheel, centrifugal force would simulate artificial gravity for the crew inside, mitigating the unknown effects of weightlessness.
This exact engineering concept heavily influenced Stanley Kubrick's film 2001, A Space Odyssey over a decade later.
Totally.
From that orbital staging ground, he mapped out a human mission to Mars. And we're not talking about a tiny Apollo-style capsule. He envisioned a fleet of 10 massive spacecraft, massing nearly 4,000 metric tons each, carrying 70 astronauts.
And he even explained the orbital mechanics of how to get to Mars. He popularized the concept of Hohmann transfer orbits for the public.
It's not about pointing a rocket at Mars and hitting the gas.
No, it's about burning your engines at exactly the right moment to widen your orbit around the sun until it perfectly intersects with where Mars will be months in the future.
He made the math accessible.
He even wrote a sci-fi novel about it called Project Mars, which, ironically, was rejected by 18 different publishers because it was too bogged down in technical equations.
That's hilarious. But he hits the absolute cultural jackpot when he teams up with Walt Disney.
Oh, massive impact. In 1955, Disney airs a television special called Man in Space, with von Braun acting as the technical director and primary on-screen expert.
An estimated 40 million Americans watched this broadcast.
Suddenly, the man who built the V-2 terror weapon is in everyone's living room. He's holding plastic model rockets, charming the audience, sounding like the friendly, eccentric genius next door.
It was a masterful, unparalleled rehabilitation of a public image.
But, alongside this secular scientific evangelism, there was a profound, unexpected personal shift occurring in his private life.
Oh, you mean his religious conversion?
Yeah. Back in Germany, von Braun was known to his friends and colleagues as a merry heathen. He had absolutely no interest in religion or theology.
But in 1946, while living under military guard at Fort Bliss, he attends a small white-frame church in the hot Texas sun and undergoes a serious religious conversion to evangelical Christianity, which represents a massive philosophical pivot.
Right.
He later spoke constantly in interviews and essays about how science and religion complement each other perfectly. He met with prominent religious leaders like Billy Graham and civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr.
He would say things like, "Through science, man strives to learn more of the mysteries of creation. Through religion, he seeks to know the Creator."
It's hard not to view that conversion through the lens of his past.
Oh, absolutely.
Historians like Michael Neufeld have analyzed this heavily. Many believe that his turn to religion was a deeply necessary psychological mechanism to pacify his own conscience after the moral chaos and immense unspoken guilt associated with his service to the Third Reich.
Having concluded a terrible bargain with a totalitarian devil in Germany, he perhaps felt an overwhelming internal need to have a forgiving God securely at his side in America.
It's a highly plausible interpretation. He was a man highly adept at compartmentalizing his past while meticulously engineering his future.
For sure.
But even as he was teaching Sunday school and preaching the peaceful exploration of the cosmos on Disney, there was a darker, deeply pragmatic side to his space station concept that he didn't broadcast quite as loudly to the kids watching TV.
The military application.
Right. Von Braun understood the reality of the Cold War was the containment of the Soviet Union. He was fully aware, and wrote explicitly in military circles, that his rotating space station could easily be armed with nuclear missiles.
It would grant the United States absolute orbital and orbit-to-ground warfare superiority.
If you control the high ground of orbit, you control the Earth.
Exactly. He called such military applications particularly dreadful, but he ensured the Pentagon knew the capability was fundamentally baked into the design.
He was likely a complex amalgamation of a visionary, a penitent, and the ultimate pragmatist. He knew he needed military money to build his rockets, so he offered them the ultimate high ground. But all the PR in the world and all the theoretical military advantages couldn't get his rockets off the ground without a massive external catalyst to force the government's hand.
And that catalyst arrived in the night sky in October 1957.
Sputnik.
Yes.
The Soviet Union absolutely shocks the world by launching the first artificial satellite. Suddenly, the American government is in a state of absolute panic.
Because the Soviets have proven they have rockets powerful enough to drop a nuclear warhead anywhere in the United States.
Right. The U.S. Navy tries to launch their Vanguard rocket to answer the Soviets, and it is a completely humiliating failure.
It loses thrust, falls back down, and explodes in a massive fireball on the launch pad in front of the world's press.
The pressure is immense. So the military finally turns to von Braun and his German team, who had been quietly developing their own rockets in the background.
The government essentially says, we need a win now, and we don't care who gets it first.
And von Braun was ready. In early 1958, his team successfully launches Explorer-1, the West's first satellite, using a modified Redstone rocket called Juno 1st.
This single successful launch formally signaled the birth of the American space program.
The dynamics shifted overnight. By 1960, von Braun's entire operation is assimilated into the newly formed civilian agency, NASA, and he becomes the first director of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama.
Now he's the boss again, with the backing of the U.S. government, and he brings a very specific, stubborn engineering philosophy to NASA.
What kind of philosophy?
Well, von Braun was notoriously conservative in his designs. He believed in massive safety factors, heavy metals, and highly redundant structural integrity. He wasn't trying to build the lightest, sleekest, most mathematically perfect rocket.
Right.
He was trying to build a brute force machine that absolutely would not fail under any circumstances.
Other American aerospace engineers constantly fought with him. They wanted to shave off every possible ounce of weight to maximize the payload capacity, but von Braun flatly refused to compromise on structural thickness.
His peers at NASA headquarters jokingly referred to his Marshall Space Flight Center as the Chicago Bridge and Iron Works.
Because his rocket stages looked like they were built out of heavy industrial steel rather than lightweight aerospace aluminum.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
Fellow German engineer Kraft Erich likened von Braun's approach to building the Brooklyn Bridge.
That analogy perfectly captures his mindset. If you only need a bridge to hold a golf cart, most engineers will design a lightweight structure, perfectly optimized for that exact weight.
Sure.
Von Braun insists on building a massive suspension bridge capable of holding a dozen fully loaded semi-trucks, just to be safe. It might be slow to build, it might be incredibly heavy, but it will never, ever collapse.
But that extreme caution actually costs the United States dearly in the short term.
Wait, how did it cost them?
It cost them a massive historical milestone. During the Project Mercury days, von Braun's team suffered a frustrating failure known as the 4-inch mission.
The 4-inch mission?
Yeah, an uncrewed Redstone rocket lifted off merely 4 inches before the engines shut down, due to a slightly short power plug prong disconnecting too early.
Oh, man.
After fixing the plug, von Braun insisted on running one more fully uncrewed test flight before putting a human astronaut on board.
His team and the astronauts argued the fix was incredibly simple, just make the prong longer. But von Braun wouldn't budge. He demanded the extra uncrewed test to be absolutely certain.
And because of the time it took to run that extra test, the Soviet Union launched Yuri Gagarin into orbit.
3 weeks later, von Braun's rocket safely launched Alan Shepard. But the delay meant the U.S. had officially lost the race to put the first man in space.
It was a bitter pill to swallow for the American public and the astronauts. However, the immense historical irony is that the very same conservative, over-engineered approach that cost them the first man in space is exactly what ensured the Americans safely reached the moon before the end of the decade.
Right, because of the Saturn V.
When his team was designing the massive Saturn V rocket to fulfill John F. Kennedy's mandate, they utilized a structural design from a previous iteration, the C-4.
Okay.
The C-4 had a massive, incredibly heavy thrust structure crossbeam at its base. Because it was so absurdly over-engineered, it could easily absorb the mind-boggling thrust of an added fifth F1 engine without requiring a total redesign of the rocket's base.
And we have to talk about the physics of those F1 engines. They were absolute monsters. A single F1 engine was pumping 3 tons of liquid oxygen and 2 tons of refined kerosene into the combustion chamber every single second.
The plumbing required to move that much fluid without the pipes imploding is a masterclass in fluid dynamics.
They faced massive issues with combustion instability, where the burning fuel would create acoustic shock waves that could vibrate the rocket to pieces.
Yeah, they had to weld complex acoustic baffles into the injector plates to stabilize the explosions.
But von Braun's heavy bridge-building methodology contained it all. The Saturn V worked flawlessly. On July 16, 1969, the Saturn V successfully launched the Apollo 11 crew toward the Sea of Tranquility.
It was the culmination of his life's work, stretching all the way back to the toy wagon in Berlin.
And it's worth noting that while he was managing this incredible pressure cooker technical feat in Alabama, he was also navigating the intense, volatile social climate of the 1960s American South.
Yes.
The sources note that von Braun publicly opposed the racial segregation policies of Alabama's infamous Governor George Wallace.
He went on record warning that racism, segregated schools, and discrimination were actively obstructing the state's economic and technological development.
It was an unusual and bold stance for a high-profile figure in the Deep South at that time, though it was certainly aligned with federal NASA policy to integrate their facility.
He finally gave humanity the moon. But what happens to the man who achieves his lifelong impossible mission at age 57?
Right, the climax of his life has passed, the moon has been reached, but the shadows of his past in Germany still follow him.
After the triumph of Apollo 11, public interest in spaceflight waned far more rapidly than anyone at NASA anticipated.
The political will to fund deep space exploration just evaporated, and NASA's budget was severely slashed.
Von Braun was deeply frustrated. He had drawn up comprehensive, crewed mission plans to Mars for the 1980s, but the government simply wasn't interested in footing the bill.
Realizing his expansive visions were now entirely incompatible with NASA's shrinking, shuttle-focused reality, he retired from the agency in 1972 and took a job in the private sector with aerospace firm Fairchild Industries.
And his health began to fail shortly after he left the agency. In 1973, he was diagnosed with kidney cancer.
He fought it for a few years, using his remaining energy to help establish the National Space Institute to keep public advocacy for space alive.
But the disease ultimately progressed. He passed away from pancreatic cancer in 1977 at the age of 65.
He's buried in Virginia, and his gravestone has a quote from Psalm 19.1. "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork.
It is a peaceful, reflective epitaph for a man whose life was surrounded by so much deafening noise, world-altering triumph, and horrific controversy.
But his cultural legacy remained deeply polarized, especially outside the halls of NASA.
Oh, definitely. Hollywood and cultural satirists heavily scrutinized his past, refusing to let the Apollo triumphs erase Peenemünde.
The titular character in Stanley Kubrick's brilliant film Dr. Strangelove, a former Nazi scientist struggling to control his fascist reflexes while advising the American president, is widely considered to be at least partially modeled on von Braun.
And you have the comedian Mort Saul, who famously joked about von Braun's autobiography.
The book was titled I Am at the Stars.
Right, and Saul suggested the book needed a subtitle.
But sometimes I hit London.
Yeah. Then there's the famous biting satirical song by Tom Lehrer with the lyrics, "Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department," says Wernher von Braun.
It highlights the widespread cultural perception that he was driven entirely by an amoral expediency. A man who didn't care about the consequences of his creations as long as he got to build them.
Yet, within the aerospace and engineering community, his contributions are viewed as absolutely foundational to the modern world. Sam Phillips, the director of the Apollo program, bluntly stated on the record that he did not believe the United States would have reached the moon at all without Wernher von Braun's leadership, his engineering genius, and his ability to manage massive, complex systems.
When you look at the totality of this life, the aristocratic beginnings, the failure in math, the obsession with the stars, the slave labor and the freezing underground tunnels of Germany, the slick Disney specials in America, and ultimately the human footprints on the lunar surface, how do you even begin to categorize a legacy like that?
Perhaps his life serves as the ultimate, unvarnished testament to the dual-use nature of technology.
How do you mean?
A rocket engine is governed entirely by the laws of physics and thermodynamics. It possesses no morality. It simply produces thrust. The combustion chamber doesn't care if it's carrying a high-explosive warhead to a city block in London or carrying a capsule of explorers to the moon. The moral weight, the guilt, the devastating consequences, and the glory rest entirely on the fragile, flawed human beings who aim it.
That is a heavy, incredible thought. We've gone from horse-drawn wagons filled with solid fuel fireworks on a German sidewalk to the absolute pinnacle of human engineering, harnessing millions of pounds of thrust with the Saturn V. Thank you for coming along with us on this deep dive into the source material. It is a historical biography that defies simple categorization or easy moral absolutes.
The immense complexities of his life require us to hold two deeply contradictory truths simultaneously. He was undeniably instrumental in one of humanity's greatest scientific achievements, and he was undeniably complicit in one of its greatest atrocities.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own. During an interview after the Apollo moon landing, von Braun was asked to justify the immense billions of dollars expense of spaceflight when there were so many problems back on Earth.
Right.
He argued that spaceflight gave mankind a chance to become immortal, that once Earth can no longer support us, we can emigrate to the stars. Think about that for a second. If humanity does eventually leave a dying Earth on rockets descended from von Braun's designs, will we look back at the terrifying, blood-soaked origins of those rockets as a tragic necessity of history, or as a permanent moral stain on our journey to the stars?